Shawn, what type of rewards encourage good ethical leadership? We all know, punishment is for people who do the wrong thing, but what kind of rewards for doing the right thing?
So, the thing that struck me about this question is it sort of assumes that there's a difference between business performance and ethical conduct, right? And we know that they've got to be linked together, right? That every business decision has ethical components. So I think the easy answer to this is just think about how we reward positive business behavior and take those rewards and have them for ethical behavior. So, if you've got an award for top salesperson, why not have an award for outstanding ethical behavior or outstanding ethical achievement? There are some companies that are starting to establish these kinds of awards that reward ethical behavior. Where my wife works, they're a big fan of the spot bonus. So if you've gone above and beyond the call of duty, right? If you stayed at work till 2 a.m. to make sure a project's going to meet its deadline, you get a spot bonus. Well, why don't we have spot bonuses for ethical behavior? When somebody's done something good for the organization, or they've established a very admirable compliance record in, sort of whatever categories you have for compliance, why don't they get a spot bonus, right? So I think you can use the same kind of rewards that you encourage business behavior, that you use for business, that businesses use for business, organizations use for business behavior, they could use for ethical behavior. And then the last thing I wanted to say there is, like you said in your question, we tend to focus a lot on punishments, right? But if you really want to establish an ethical culture, we know rewards and incentives are a key to establishing an ethical, an organizational culture. So if you want an ethical culture, you've got to incorporate rewards and incentives in that.
Very good. Okay, we're ready for the next one. And this is the one you asked me some questions on.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And actually, I think Eric addressed this a little bit in his presentation. So, are we ready?
Mm-hmm.
Shawn, why is it so hard for organizations to overcome complacency when it comes to ethical leadership, both from superiors as well as subordinates? Everyone seems to want to just get on the sidelines.
Well, I have to admit that when I first got these questions and I saw that question, I was a little bit confused by what this question meant, right? But when I really got my head around what this question meant, I think complacency is actually one of the most difficult problems that organizations deal with. Right? People like the status quo. They don't like the change, right? They like the way things move along. And I think when we're talking in the realm of ethics and ethical behavior, one of the easiest ways to get out of complacency is to make sure that you're really linking organizational decisions back to the code of ethics for the organization. Make the code of ethics a living document, right? If you're always talking about what the code of ethics says, then it means employees aren't going to get into the habit of unethical behavior, and then it's going to become part of the company culture, and then we're going to have to break out of complacency to try to change that, right? You just make those discussions part of everyday life in the way the business works. And then I think, we've also talked about rewards and incentives and punishments. And I think one of the easiest ways you can avoid complacency is to make sure that you're active with punishments and rewards. Good leaders aren't just quick to punish, but they're also quick to praise, right? So keep talking about the good things that happen in the organization, as well as making sure you're dealing with the bad, and that's going to keep people on their toes, right? That's gonna sort of snap us out of being complacent.
Very good.
Okay.
Shawn, we talked a lot about complacency and getting people involved in following the code of ethics or code of conduct in a company. But what about reporting misconduct?
So I think for me that's a really interesting question, OC, because I'm fortunate enough to never have been in a position where just talking to my supervisor didn't handle the situation. So I'm really speaking theoretically here because I've never actually used any of the reporting mechanisms any organization I've worked for had for reporting ethical misconduct. But assuming, outside the standard stuff that, you've talked about in the certificate program, hotlines, having an ombudsperson, board committees, all that kind of stuff. To me, one of the best things to do is just the sort of skip level method of talking about ethical misbehavior, where you don't talk to your boss, but you talk to your boss's boss, right? Because usually the higher up you go in an organization, the more they're going to be concerned about this kind of ethical misconduct, right? And it has to be, obviously, it has to be ethical misconduct that you want to trouble your boss's boss about. You know, you don't want to go to your boss's boss about Joe stealing paper clips or whatever. But if there's something going on in the organization that you think really needs to be dealt with, and talking to your boss doesn't handle the situation, try going to your boss's boss. And, you know, the other thing here is, hopefully you're going to have mentors in whatever organization you work in. Go talk to your mentor and think about how, you know, talk to them about how they would handle the situation and what mechanisms they might use to deal with the situation. But I have to say, just in terms of organizational culture and being, you know, not disrupting the organizational culture, unless it's something where you're concerned about what your boss is doing, the first thing you should do, I think, is go talk to your boss and get their advice on what's going on. Or, you know, if it's a situation where you can do this, go talk to the person whose misbehavior you're concerned about, right? Because you may have a misunderstanding of what's going on. You may not actually be seeing things clearly, but, you know, work within the chain of command before you start worrying about disrupting organizational processes to try to get this dealt with. But if you have to do that, you know, that's what you have to do, unfortunately.
What about anonymous reporting? I mean, most public companies have anonymous reporting.
Right, and, you know, like I said, I sort of prefaced that on, if you don't have those avenues. You know, obviously, if your company has a hotline set up, use the hotline. That's what it's there for, right? And, you know, most companies have gone to a situation where they actually have a third party who handles the hotline phone calls. So you don't have to worry about what the company is going to do with the information, because, you know, where you're reporting to anonymizes all the information. Even if they had any way of figuring out where it came from, caller ID or whatever, they're not going to share that information with the organization, because that company's reputation is on the line if they were sharing information that they shouldn't be. So I think employees can feel confident when there's an anonymous hotline that it really is anonymous.
Good. Thanks, Shawn.